Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pod TV's number one investment show, Wall Street Hackers with Peter Bennett. Let's talk about Peter just a little bit. He received his BA in economics at UCLA, a law degree from the University of Miami Law School, an MBA in finance from New York University, and he worked on Wall Street and in finance for 17 years. And Peter is here to bring you all of those years of education and experience to help you swim through these stormy waters that we're having right now with the economic situation. And he's also just going to bring you some of the most interesting stories that you won't hear anywhere else. He's going to give you that dividend pick of the week that I have learned has been directly on spot. Everyone, please help me welcome my favorite investor, Peter Bennett. Hi, Peter.
Hey, thanks. Welcome back, Kim, as a moderator. And you're right about stormy waters. I mean, it's really tough in a way because I don't want to be negative about things, but there are some stormy waters for the market, the economy, politics. There's a lot going on right now. I'll get into that a little later when we get into the markets, but welcome, audience, to Wall Street Hackers, October 3rd, Thursday. You can catch a new episode most weeks starting on Thursdays or Saturdays, depending on your distribution channel. We will, however, take 1 week off next week, and we'll be back starting Thursday, October 17th. So on to the markets. One interesting point is the worst performing sector for the last 3 months is ... tech. So Wall Street Hackers know that during the last few months, we started talking about the fact that AI was possibly oversold or overhyped, let's say, because a lot of companies were coming in with reports and there were surveys that they weren't getting great results from AI and maybe looking at cutting back on spending. And, there's no doubt AI is coming. It is coming big time. And it could really shake things up positively and negatively, and we'll be watching that. But right now we're priced for AI perfection, or we were. So tech did not do too well in the last 3 months. The other thing about the market generally, I would say regarding tech, is that tech had boosted the market for 2 years, maybe beyond. I'd have to look back, but it obviously everybody knows who follows the market closely that it boosted the market a lot. So, and then the theory was, now everybody's going to rotate to another sector. Well, my point there is that it is true that funds might flow into another sector. So some of these other stocks and sectors might be boosted, but that doesn't change the fundamentals of the businesses and the profits of the other businesses in the other sectors. So it doesn't necessarily mean, two wrongs make a right or whatever. And so, there's no guarantee where the market is going, not to mention the macro environment. So let's get into that now. And, then I'm going to go with a little half glass full thing, because there's a lot going on right now. The macro environment is currently filled with so many major issues and potential pitfalls. One, the question major is, and we've been asking that, is, has the Fed really beaten inflation, even if there aren't any upsets in their plans? Two, are we headed for some recession or even, a hard landing? And more about that later, but a fascinating study that I thought was fascinating. If you love finance, you'll find it fascinating. But an interesting study about the possibilities of recession and inflation and the Fed winning the war. And it comes from the Fed itself. Most interesting story in regards to that type of thing I've seen in a while. So there are obviously geopolitical issues. I wrote that before today's news and yesterday's news, but I mean, we're on the brink of big problems in the Middle East. Biden just said something like Israel attacking the oil fields in Iran are not off the table. Now, my interpretation of that is Israel told them, because they really consult with them a whole lot now, Israel told them we're going to attack the oil fields. I could be wrong about that. Of course, these are guesses, but they probably have in mind to talk the oil fields. I was thinking if I was Israel, probably I'd attack the oil field to get a big bang for the buck, upset the Iranian economy. It won't be good for the markets. And an analyst I read just about 2 minutes before I came on was saying that it's going to really shake the S&P 500 up. I'm not sure. Again, this isn't our investment philosophy, but to go short term or anything like that. And finally, of course, government debt and spending, as we always say, is out of control totally, with 125 trillion in debt, counting unfunded liabilities in the United States. This is not a good environment to keep inflation under control. So whether it's a hard landing or a soft landing, more on that in about a minute or two. But let me give it a little glass half full, because I could go negative on some of this stuff. So what to do section, which we usually have. 1, Wall Street Hackers believes that despite all the issues, the market will eventually rise over the coming years, as the US and other countries use yield curve control to bring down interest rates. They're going to do it. They're going to attempt it and almost certainly succeed. Basically, buying all the bonds that are over a certain rate. You can look it up. It's been done in World War II by the United States. It's not new. Japan did it for years, arguably, or at least they did it in the last decade. And Australia did it not too long ago. So this is not news to countries. It's basically how are we going to monetize the debt. So that is coming, but with rates coming down, it will help the market because there won't be as many alternatives, and because companies with debt will have lower debt, so it will stimulate the market a bit. So again, we're not forecasting great results. That's the second point. The market, we believe, is going to be slower than normal. The last few decades were great with interest rates coming down, not too much turmoil, and the debt being kicked down the road. But it's going to be a rough ride, in terms of expecting very high returns, especially higher than high returns other than nominal returns. In other words, you might get 4%, or let's say you get 5.7%. There's a reason I'm saying that. We'll cover that in another show. But let's say you get 5.7% of the market, but inflation's at 3.5 or 4. You are gaining, but you're not gaining that much on average like people used to get. So it's going to be a bit of tougher market, and that gets to the third point, which is if you're going to be in the market, whether in any environment, we believe you want dividend stocks, dividend growth stocks, MLPs, REITs. All our studies show it over decades and decades, 100 years of different studies, and we'll probably get back into that a minute. So now we get into this study. So again, we're staying invested in everything, including bonds, but long-term bonds for steady income. And your allocations will vary, but we're not saying panic or anything like that. But you want to be in the right sectors, and also companies with defensive balance sheet, defensive sectors, and strong cash flows. That's the place to be anytime. But in rough water, we really want this protection. So hard landing or soft landing. Last week we mentioned the study. I give credit to Damir Tokic for the article, because he's the one who wrote some of these lines and also brought the Fed study to my attention. So the Fed's recent study with data from 1960 to 2019 from 13 advanced economies identifies 149 easing cycles. These easing cycles follow the hiking cycles, where the central banks increase interest rates in response to higher inflation, subsequently starting to cut interest rates. Exactly where we've been and are now. They're starting to cut interest rates. Out of 149 easing cases, 124, 83% resulted in easing due to an outright recession, a credit event, or systematic risk. So those really don't count because we're not in that situation. We don't have a credit event or an outright recession now. However, in 25 cases, the central banks started lowering rates as inflation started falling. They called this inflation abating cases. That is where we are. So that of those 25 cases, out of the 25 inflation abating cases, 14 cases, or 56%, ended up in inflation failure, meaning the inflation rate increased after the initial easing and the central bank was forced to start hiking again. That's what we've been concerned about. In 11 cases, or 44% of the inflation abating cases, the inflation actually falls to the target, and they call this inflation success. So they did, in 44%, achieve inflation success. However, out of the 11 cases where they did achieve inflation success, 6 of those cases ended up in a recession or a growth failure. So bottom line, this is Wall Street Hackers' obvious conclusion from the data. Out of the 25 times that there were inflation abating cases in these countries, including, I'm sure, the US a number of times, only 5 out of 25, there was a soft landing with both inflation success and growth success. So 20%, who knows? It might be somewhere in between, maybe a little failure, or maybe a lot of inflation failure or recession, but certainly it's not the 100% optimistic that some of the market seem optimism that's justified by some in the market. Quote of the week: BlackRock CEO Larry Fink said Tuesday that investors are wrong if they think, of course this justifies our position, but so there's a little danger there. BlackRock CEO said but he is a smart guy, by the way, runs BlackRock. He thinks that the Fed will make, that the investors are wrong if they think the Fed will make massive interest rate cuts later this year, because the billionaire money man believes the U.S. economy will continue to grow. Fink dismissed market predictions that rates will be slashed further through the end of the year after Chairman Powell lowered them by 0.5% 2 weeks ago. Quote, I do believe there's room for more easing, but I see the more policies by more governments that tend to be inflationary. With that in mind, it is hard for me to see another 200 basis points in a decline in short rates. So that sounds about right, and what we think it will happen. I think there will be some rate cuts probably, and no one can be certain, but we believe the market is overestimating the kind of rate cuts with 2% next year, ongoing rate cuts. There's not only no guarantees of that, but it sounds a lot like what they've been doing the last 2 years, which is overestimating the rate cuts. So we will see. 4 most interesting stories of the week section. Number 1, ICE, the immigration agency that enforces immigration control, admitted this week that its database includes a rounded 662,000 non-citizens with criminal histories, including 13,000 convicted murderers, 2,000 accused killers, and 20,000 suspected rapists. But don't worry, because out of that database, they are currently detaining 277 migrants who are who were convicted of homicide, and 51 who are still facing homicide charges. But of course, that's out of 100,000s. But don't worry. Of course, ABC and NBC News failed to mention the findings that ICE presented to Congress at all on the evening news. I understand why, because they were busy covering Sean Diddy Combs' story, plus a story about Harris's first trip ever to the border. Nothing important to mention, just a little bit about an ICE report. Interesting story, too. I had to repeat this. Maybe Kim didn't hear it. Nick probably didn't hear it because Mark was our moderator last week, and it's just some story. So a rare repeat. This is one I had to repeat. Elon Musk says SpaceX is going to launch 5 uncrewed starships to Mars. SpaceX plans to launch about 5 of the commercial space company's Starship rockets without crews to Mars in 2 years. Elon Musk, the CEO, said, if these all land safely, then crewed missions are possible in 4 years. The crewed missions would be delayed by another 2 years in case of any challenges. So, although challenging, we're talking about a possible manned landing on Mars this decade. Or close. That should be interesting for sure. Interesting story number 3. So the Middle East is at war, even more today. The ports strike could be affecting supply chains and even inflation. And there was a vice presidential debate on Tuesday. Footnote in which Vance really creamed Waltz. Footnote 2. Waltz misspoke on one claim, and he actually said this. He said, in explaining, he said, sometimes I'm a knucklehead. Okay? Anyway, so someone might think that all this, the hurricane, also everything might, hit the news reports on the evening news, but not CNN or MSNBC. I tuned in at 5 p.m. yesterday, to watch both and went back and forth. So all CNN talks about for the first half hour is that the prosecutor has filed new charges against Trump for a solid half hour. But MSNBC spends the entire hour on one story. The entire hour. That was all they covered for an hour. Finally, the newscast ends. Okay, let's have some news from MSNBC at 6 p.m. I watched for another half hour. Guess what? Breaking news. A protester has filed Trump's charges on the 2020 election. So basically, an hour and a half straight, not a mention of anything else. Nothing else important in the world. So informative, intellectual, and relevant. And exciting. Anyway, back to a positive story or a useful story. Interesting story number 4. Dr. Dave Rabin, R-A-B-I-N, a neuroscientist and psychiatrist, said, quote, falling asleep too quickly can be a sign of exhaustion, a sign that we are overworking ourselves, a sign of burnout. I have to admit, I often fall asleep within a minute immediately, so maybe I'm working a bit too hard. I wouldn't be surprised. Anyway, according to the National Sleep Foundation, it suggests it should take about 15 or 20 minutes for a healthy person to fall asleep. But of course, they also say the ideal amount of time for falling asleep varies from person to person. Experts also recommend 7 or 9 hours of sleep a night to avoid the risk of serious chronic health conditions. And many Americans have and will be struggling with that goal. Common best practices include 1, keeping a regular sleep schedule, 2, cutting off caffeine 12 hours before bedtime. I'm not sure everybody's doing that. 3, avoiding late meals and alcohol. Not sure everybody's doing that either. And keeping your bedroom as cool, dark, and quiet as possible. And finally, avoiding smartphones and computers and other blue light devices, especially in the hours leading up to bed. And I know I don't do that. I should try to get off the computer before, the late hours. Anyway, dividend pick of the week, disclaimers. Wall Street Hackers for entertainment only. No guarantees on any of our suggestions because nobody can guarantee any suggestions. If they are, there's a problem. The only thing you can guarantee is a fixed income investment, obviously like a CD or something, and then there's inflation risk. These are only our opinions. Consult your financial advisor. So we've begun a series on utility sector, and we continue with that series. We like utilities a lot because of obvious safety, and believe there's still opportunities because of data center growth, which is going to be certain, and also increased chip usage. And we covered a story recently on Wall Street Hackers that the creation of a chip itself uses as much electricity as is used by the chip in its entire 10 years. So as long as they're making chips, that uses half the electricity right there, not to mention the chip usage. So this week, D, or Dominion Energy, which is we have a 0.25% allocation. I'll explain why. Mostly it looks great. Dominion is an energy utility primarily in Virginia and the Carolinas. Kim probably knows who they are. What we like is a yield of 4.5%. Price to cash flow is 10.5. That's very healthy. And that means a 9.5% cash flow yield. We love cash flow yield, obviously, because it allows companies to pay more dividends down the road or reinvest or buy back shares. A decent debt to asset ratio of 0.41. It has had a very steady, but a little slow for what we like, growth, because it has grown its dividend steadily, but only by 10% in the last 10 years. So we're going with a 0.25% because we like the 4.5, especially with even 10% growth in 10 years, but we're going to watch it and hope that it accelerates with the good cash flows they have. Maybe we'll do better. Definitely a safe sector. So we're way ahead of time. I really have been working hard to not get cut off by during our panel discussion. So maybe we'll even finish this week, which would be a record. Panel question of the week. And Kim can come on. Will the border issue ever be resolved is the question. Will the border issue ever be resolved? Background. And it's pretty brief background because it's pretty clear. So despite protests, it is very clear that Harris, Biden, and many, but maybe not all, but many Democrats want either wide open borders or close to wide open borders. If they didn't, they wouldn't have undone 97 executive orders that were in place to protect the border as soon as they took office. That's a lot of executive orders to repeal immediately without even testing to see, will this have an effect? Two, wouldn't have protested the completion of the border wall, despite some different criticisms. The border wall is an effective deterrent in general. Three, wouldn't have, Biden wouldn't have auctioned off part of the wall when he came into office. He actually took parts of the wall that were where he had the material, and he sold it off at a loss, a big loss. It's like, wait, you don't even want it to build the wall? You already paid for that. Also, Harris clearly wouldn't have said she supported gender transition for illegal aliens in 2019 or push cutting the funding of ICE. Republicans, on the other hand, take the stance that reform on migration has to wait because with open borders or significantly open borders, legislation cannot solve the problem or control the inflows. I see that argument to a point because if you have unlimited borders or out of control borders, what does it matter what laws you pass? But either way, they refuse to act at all. This issue has been debated for decades, at least. I mean, immigration has been an issue since the early 1900s, but this particular issue has been a big issue, especially in the last few years with increased immigration. So the real question is, will the border issue and how, if ever, will it ever be resolved? Or are we going to be with this for the next 20 or 30 years? Kim? I cannot hear you, Kim.
There we go.
I can hear you now.
Question. I think that this is brought up a lot, mostly to be a smokescreen to cover other issues that are there. But I've worked with Department of Homeland Security's director who reports to the president for years. And back in 2016, one of his biggest complaints is the list that you provided, which is caused by the catch and release program that nobody has gone out to get rid of. And the catch and release means that they can catch these people, give them an order to show up to court, but they never do. So, yeah, there are a lot of criminals in this country, but not as many as there are good, hardworking people. I think
that's definitely true.
Right. So but I think we need to remove that law, right? The catch and release needs to go away. And when we do catch somebody, that they don't have the same rights as we do to a hearing in court and stuff like that. We just put them in prison and they can wait until their opportunity is there, because the catch and release does not work. So there was a law presented by Harris about a month ago, and I was pretty impressed with all of the provisions in there. It was very nonpartisan. All law enforcement in the sector of border control were all for it. It would give them the funding they needed, the resources they needed, but it wasn't voted for. And I don't know why. I mean, you have Republicans complaining and whining that we need something done about the border, and it was presented and it was voted down. And you've got your conspiracy theories that Trump told them to do it. I don't know if he did or not. What I'd like is a list of the people who voted it down and why, because that was the proposal after 4 years of research and digging deep to the root of the problem, because sometimes you have to dig deep, do a lot of research, hash out the problems to present a solution. And, the border is going to take more meat. For me, it would take more than 4 years of research to present a solution. But what they did was present a solution, and it was voted down.
Very good. A few points you made, a lot of good points. And you're right. There are definitely more, great. Listen, migrants can be very hard workers, even if they're illegally. I know many, and they're honest, hardworking people. The other side is, though, that, if it's out of control, you get 600,000 criminals and murderers and rapists, and not to mention drugs and everything. It's kind of a problem to have things not under control, because you could let some of those people in anyway. But a couple of points. One, that bill, there's 2 or 3 points about that. But number one, that bill, they say, Trump stopped it. It's a Democratic Senate, and the Senate never passed it. The Democratic Senate never passed it. Why is that? Because it was not really enforcing the law. If you look at the details, and some Democrats said, I cannot vote for this because I'm going to get killed in the election, because that would have basically firmly put into place. I mean, it had some positive provisions, but it would have firmly allowed huge amounts of aliens in on a regular basis. I think it was 5,000 a day. And that's like, okay, it's down from 8 or 10, but now we could have 5,000, and it would only limit the 5 under certain conditions if the president actually took action. So theoretically, if Harris, if she was president, or Biden or whatever said, or any president was said, well, I don't really mind the 5,000, so I'm not going to enforce it. It's like, and there were other provisions in there. You go, this is not a serious bill. But wait, let me just finish.
Well, I mean, I'm curious, are you controlling the volume and flow to 5,000 versus 10,000? Because, Trump and everyone have exaggerated numbers. Oh, they're letting millions in a day. It's 10 million a day. 5 million a day. And so I'm curious, are we controlling the volume at this rate? Because you're going to have some flow come in.
No. The border was almost secure. It was very close to secure before Biden did away with the 97 executive orders. Let me finish, Kim, and then you can add.
I mean, COVID.
Kim, we have extra time. Let me finish.
I know, but we can.
I want to give my conclusion.
Probably agree that COVID controlled the border more than the Border Patrol, because people weren't moving during COVID, and so I agree with you. During 2020 and 21. Probably the border was the tightest it's ever been because of COVID. People just
Kim, let me finish first, and then
I agree.
We're going to run out of time, and I want to give my conclusions.
I know.
So I was just mentioning that bill in the Democratic Senate. So let me give my conclusions. And this is a very neutral kind of conclusion. So in a way, I try to tailor it so that even people who disagree, can understand what, both sides. So here's my conclusion. The key conclusion is, the only way this ever gets resolved in any direction is if we get undivided government, because there would have to be a president and both houses of Congress on the same, taking the same position. So if we get undivided Democratic control, which we might get, we would have either an established open border policy or an effective open border policy. And the one good thing, at least for what it's worth, is Democrats would come out and explain why they like that, the arguments for it, and their rationale. And I can actually think of some rationales for it. If you want open borders, fine. Yeah. If Republicans win, then we're likely going to see a much more secure border for sure, immediately probably. And also, then it's more likely, once that's secure, that there will be legislation. But that legislation will limit migration. It will, on the positive side, control who's getting in. It would favor, very likely, migrants who would be positive contributors to our society, and limit those who would be a burden. This is exactly what Australia has. This is what many countries have. Canada has. You cannot just go to Australia and Canada and walk through their doors. They have to. You have to prove that you either have an ongoing business or you're going to not be a burden to society and not go in their welfare system. This is what makes sense in a way, but it's never going to happen probably. And they might get together these sides, but when it's black and white, they're not. Gray isn't going to work. So we'll always have black and white. So that's my number one conclusion. Unless we get a sweep now or at some times, this thing could be going on for the rest of our lives.
Well, and I keep saying, until we unite the government, we're not going to get anything done. People just don't unite anymore. And I think they divide us on purpose so that they can get their little things behind the scenes going on. One of the things I found interesting is...
wait, we're
out of time. But I'm curious. Right. One second, though. Cuba's borders are pretty secure. We can't go to Cuba, but people in Canada go to Cuba all the time. The borders are open to people from Canada. So keep that in mind for another conversation, because I'm curious why that is. You got to go.
Sorry. Right. We're really out of hard time.
Wrap up with your favorite wrap.
Okay. So as Kim always says, get healthy, get wealthy. We just cut it close. See you soon. See you in 2 weeks. Bye.